The chamber doors sealed behind me with a sound like a held breath being released, and every eye in the room that could see me turned my way at once. I did not flinch. There were 9 delegations seated around the great curved table of the Galactic Council, each one older than my entire species, each one wrapped in robes or shells or shimmering fields that spoke of power I could not fully measure. And then there was my seat, a small chair, bolted to the floor at the far end of the table, angled slightly away from the center, so that whoever sat there had to twist their neck just to be seen. It was not an accident, it was a message. Humanity, the smallest and youngest voice in the room, would be given the smallest and least comfortable place to sit. I sat down anyway, folded my hands on the table, and waited. The delegate from the Thren Assembly was speaking when I entered, and he did not pause for me. His voice came out as a low, resonant hum, translated a half-second later into words that hung in the air above his seat, like glowing script only I seemed to bother reading. The human application, he was saying, arrives before this council 11 years after first contact. 11 years. The Varath Compact waited 400 years before requesting associate status. The Ophiran systems waited 800. And yet these humans, barely out of their own atmosphere in any meaningful galactic sense, demand full membership as though it were owed to them. A murmur passed through the chamber. Not words, just a ripple of shared disapproval, the kind of sound a room makes when everyone already agrees and is simply confirming it to each other. I kept my hands folded and said nothing. Across from me, near the center of the table, sat Counselor Ve Ordamos, the presiding chair for this session, a being whose species I still did not have a polite word for in any human language. Something between a jellyfish and a cathedral, drifting gently inside a containment field that hummed with soft blue light. Ordamos turned one of many eye stalks toward me. "Attaché," Ordamos said, and the translated word came out flat, almost bored. "Does your delegation wish to respond to the concerns raised?" I could have stood up. I could have argued. I had a folder of statistics in front of me, printed on actual paper because the council found our data slates aesthetically aggressive. Numbers about population growth, about our fledgling colonies, about the treaties we had already signed with 3 minor species, who did not have a seat at this table, but who liked us just fine. I could have used all of it. Instead I said, "Not yet, Counselor. Please, continue." A few of the delegates exchanged glances. This was not what they expected. Humans, in every briefing, they had no doubt read about us, were supposed to be loud, impatient, eager to prove ourselves, and here I was, the entire human delegation reduced to one junior attaché in an undersized chair, declining to defend my own species. I smiled. It was small, and I tried to keep it small, because I did not want it noticed yet. But Ve Ordamos had many eyes, and one of them lingered on me a fraction of a second too long, before drifting back to the Thren delegate. "Continue then," Ordamos said. The Thren delegate did continue, and so did the delegate after him, and the one after that. Each of them found a different angle to approach the same conclusion. Humanity was too young, too erratic, too fond of contradiction, of holding 2 opposing ideas at once and calling it complicated instead of broken. Our technology, they said, was a patchwork of borrowed alien schematics stitched together with human stubbornness. Unstable, unpredictable, likely to fail catastrophically the first time it was truly tested. Our military doctrine, what little of it had been shared under the transparency requirements of the probationary period, read to their analysts like the scribbled fears of a species that had never known real safety and never would, not that this council could offer. I had read all of these reports myself. I had helped write 2 of the documents they were quoting, back when I still worked in policy rather than diplomacy, back before someone decided that a person who could sit still and listen for 6 hours without saying a word was exactly what this posting needed. None of it was wrong exactly. It just was not the whole picture. It rarely was, with reports. At the 2-hour mark, a new voice entered the debate, quieter than the others, and I looked up because quiet voices in that chamber tended to be the dangerous ones. The delegate belonged to the Karsu Directorate, a species built low and wide, with skin like polished stone, and unlike the others, she was looking directly at me when she spoke. "I would like the human attaché to answer a question directly," she said. "Not her delegation. Her, personally. since she is the only representative present. Ordimos's eye stalk swiveled toward me again. Attaché, the Karsu delegate has the floor. You may respond or decline. I unfolded my hands and rested them flat on the table. I'll answer, I said. The Karsu delegate leaned forward slightly, and her voice, even translated, carried a kind of careful precision, like someone setting down a very expensive glass. 3 days ago, a Directorate patrol vessel recorded a human military ship entering the outer edge of this system, unscheduled, unannounced. No flight plan was filed with system control, which, as you know, is a direct violation of the terms under which your species was granted access to attend this hearing at all. The murmur that had drifted through the room earlier came back, sharper this time, less like agreement and more like alarm. We would like an explanation, the Karsu delegate said, before this council decides whether your species is prepared for the responsibilities of full membership. We would like to know why, at the exact moment your civilization's future is being weighed, a warship belonging to your government has quietly placed itself within striking distance of this station. The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when several dozen powerful beings suddenly realize they do not know the answer to a question and are waiting for someone else to be afraid first. I looked at the Karsu delegate, and I let the silence sit there for exactly as long as it needed to. Not 1 second more, not 1 second less. I know the ship you mean, I said. It's called the Meridian's Watch. Then you admit humanity sent an armed vessel to intimidate this council during a sensitive vote, the Thren delegate cut in, his hum sharpening into something almost like a growl, if a hum could growl. I didn't say that, I said. You did. A ripple of something crossed the table, not quite laughter, because these were not beings prone to laughter, but something adjacent to it, an acknowledgement that I had scored a small point without raising my voice. Then clarify, Ordimos said, and for the first time, there was real interest in the flat translated voice, something underneath the boredom. I took a slow breath, not because I needed it, but because pacing mattered, and I had learned that lesson the hard way, in rooms much smaller than this one, arguing with people much less patient than jellyfish cathedrals. The Meridian's Watch, I said, did not receive special orders to come here. It did not deviate from any plan specifically because of this hearing. It is exactly where it is supposed to be, doing exactly what it always does, which is patrol the outer edge of any system where a human diplomatic presence exists, on a schedule that was set months before this hearing was even confirmed. A coincidence, the Karsu delegate said, in a tone that made clear she did not believe in coincidence. Not a coincidence, I said. A pattern, one your analysts should have already noticed, if they had been looking at the right data instead of the data we handed you. That landed harder than I expected it to. Several delegates shifted in their seats, a small mechanical adjustment of postures that, across 9 wildly different physiologies, all somehow conveyed the exact same thing, discomfort. Explain, Ordimos said again, and this time it was not a request. It was an order, delivered gently, the way a very old and very tired teacher might order a student to finally show their work. I could have explained everything right there. I had the numbers. I had the history. I had 11 years of first contact compressed into arguments sharp enough to cut through every objection in that chamber. And some part of me, the part that still remembered writing those early reports at 2 in the morning, wanted to lay it all out at once and watch their faces change. But I had learned something else in those 11 years too. Something that mattered more than being right, timing. With respect, counselor, I said, that answer will take longer than the time remaining in this session. I'd rather give it properly than rush it and have half of it lost to interpretation. Ordimos regarded me with several eyes at once, an experience I had still not gotten used to, no matter how many sessions I sat through. Very well, Ordimos said. This session is adjourned. It will resume tomorrow, at which point the human attaché will provide a full explanation for the presence of the vessel Meridian's Watch, and this council will proceed to a vote on humanity's application for full membership. Chairs shifted. Fields dimmed. Around the table, 9 ancient species began the slow process of leaving a room that had, until a few minutes ago, seemed entirely under their control. I stayed seated a moment longer than the others, gathering my folder of printed statistics that no one had asked to see, And as I did, I caught the Karsu delegate watching me from the doorway, her stone-colored face unreadable in a way that I suspected was deliberate. "You are not worried," she said. It was not quite a question. "No," I said. "Your species has been called reckless, impulsive, prone to acting before thinking." She tilted her head slightly. "You do not seem any of those things." I closed my folder and stood, and for the first time since I had walked into that chamber, I let the smile reach my eyes. "We're not," I said. "We're just very good at looking like we might be, right up until it stops being useful." She did not respond to that, and I did not wait for a response. I walked out past the empty seats of 8 species who had spent the last 2 hours deciding my people were not ready for the galaxy, and past one Karsu delegate who, unlike the rest, had at least asked the right question, even if she had not liked the answer she almost got. Outside the chamber, in the long silver corridor that connected the council wing to the diplomatic quarters, I finally let myself exhale properly. My reflection slid along the polished wall beside me, small, plain, unremarkable in every way the council would have recognized as significant. No armor, no title beyond attaché, no fleet of my own, no ancient bloodline, no technological marvel to point to. Just a woman who had read every report on the Meridian's watch, who had watched its captain train new officers for 2 years before this posting, who knew exactly how far that ship's patrol route extended, and exactly how many other ships shared identical routes around identical systems, quietly, without fanfare, because that was simply what humanity had decided, early on, to always do. Never send one ship where a formation belonged. Never leave a diplomat unguarded, even when the guard was 3 days' travel away and looked, from a distance, like nothing at all. I reached my quarters, sat down at the small terminal reserved for encrypted transmissions, and typed a short message to the fleet liaison assigned to this system. "Session adjourned. Full explanation requested tomorrow. Confirm Meridian's watch is holding standard pattern." The reply came back within minutes. Short, unbothered, exactly the tone I expected. "Confirmed. Standard pattern. No deviation. Tell them we said hello." I read it twice, then set the terminal down and looked out the narrow viewport at the slow-turning stars beyond the station, somewhere among which a single human warship sat quietly doing nothing more dramatic than exactly what it was supposed to do. Tomorrow I would have to explain, in careful and patient words, why that was somehow the most frightening thing the council had heard all day. Tonight, I let myself smile as wide as I wanted, because there was no one left in the room to notice. Not yet. But there would be. I thought back, as I often did in the quiet hours before sleep, to how we had gotten here at all. 11 years was such a short span by the council's counting. Barely a breath in the long lives of species who measured their history in millennia rather than decades. And yet in those 11 years, humanity had gone from a species barely aware it was being watched, to a species sitting, however awkwardly, at the edge of the galaxy's oldest table. The story of how that happened was not the story the council had read in its reports. It was not really the story the council had asked for either. Not the polished, careful account my predecessors had submitted through official channels. It was messier than that, stranger than that, and far more human than anything a report could capture. It began, as these things so often do, with a mistake, not ours. Theirs. They had expected, when they first found us, to find exactly what their sensors and simulations had predicted. A young, disorganized, fragile species, clinging to a single fragile world, easily categorized, easily managed, easily filed away into whatever slot the galaxy's oldest civilizations reserved for children. What they found instead did not fit any slot they had prepared. And the story of what happened next was the story I would have to tell them tomorrow, whether they were ready to hear it or not. First contact did not happen the way anyone on Earth had imagined it, and it did not happen the way the aliens had imagined it either, which turned out to be the first clue that this relationship was going to be difficult for everyone involved. The Verath scout ship that found us was not looking for us at all. It was mapping a dead system 3 light-years from Earth, cataloging debris from some ancient collision, when its long-range sensors picked up radio signals leaking out from a small blue planet nobody on their star charts had bothered to mark as interesting. The Scouts' crew, a small team of low-ranking surveyors named Isketh, and 2 others, whose names never made it into any human record, debated for 6 days about whether to investigate or file a note for a future survey and move on. They investigated. That decision would haunt every briefing document the Varath Compact ever wrote about humanity afterward. What they found, according to the official transcript later shared with our government, was a species locked in what their own analysts called a state of chronic low-level conflict, a planet divided into competing factions who nonetheless traded, communicated, and occasionally cooperated across those divisions in ways their models struggled to categorize. We were not unified. We were not peaceful. We argued about nearly everything, including, almost immediately, what to do about the fact that we were being watched. Iskith's team made the decision that changed everything. Rather than withdraw and report from a safe distance, as protocol demanded, they sent a low-power greeting broadcast toward the planet, expecting, based on every prior first contact in their long history, that the response would take months, most likely funneled through a single unified planetary government, cautious, formal, slow. They received a reply within 11 hours, not from one government, from 417 separate sources, ranging from official state broadcasts to amateur radio operators, to, memorably, a group of teenagers who had hacked into a regional emergency signal system to ask if the aliens liked music. The Varath had no framework for that. Their own history of contact with younger species had always followed the same pattern: careful, centralized, hierarchical, a single voice speaking for an entire world. What they got instead was chaos that somehow, impossibly, sorted itself out within days into something resembling coordination, as competing human governments, who had spent decades barely speaking to each other, suddenly found themselves in an emergency video call together, arguing about protocol, agreeing on almost nothing, except that whoever answered the aliens next needed to not, in the words of one leaked transcript, make us look like idiots. I was 11 years old when the first public broadcast confirmed we were not alone. I remember exactly where I was standing, in my grandmother's kitchen, watching the news alongside half the planet, and I remember that the overwhelming feeling in the room was not fear. It was something closer to relief, as though a question that had quietly worried humanity for its entire recorded history had finally, after all that waiting, been answered. The Varath were not so lucky. Their first formal report to the wider council described humanity using words that, years later, when I was assigned to read the full unredacted archive as part of my training, made me laugh out loud in an otherwise silent office. Erratic, unpredictable, alarmingly resilient to psychological pressure, displays cooperative behavior under threat that exceeds predicted thresholds for a species without centralized governance. What that last line meant, in plain language, was this: when the Varath tested us, gently, carefully, the way they had tested every young species before us, by simulating minor crises to observe our response, they expected panic, division, exploitable weakness. Instead, every single test produced the opposite. A simulated asteroid threat, deliberately leaked through diplomatic channels to see how humanity would react, resulted not in panic, but in every major spacefaring nation on Earth quietly redirecting resources toward a shared tracking initiative within 72 hours. No formal treaty required, no central authority ordering it. A false rumor of hostile alien intent, planted to test our diplomatic restraint, resulted not in outrage, but in a flood of scientific inquiry. Thousands of independent researchers requesting more data, wanting proof before reacting at all. The Varath had, without meaning to, discovered something that would take the rest of the galaxy over a decade to fully understand. Humanity did not need a single voice to move as one. We had learned, the hard way, over thousands of years of our own conflicts, how to cooperate under pressure without waiting for permission. It was not chaos. It only looked like chaos from the outside. By the time the Galactic Council itself became aware of us, 3 years after that first Varath broadcast, the story had already changed shape twice. What began as a curious survey report had become, by the time it reached the Council's attention, a matter of genuine debate among the older species. Some argued humanity represented an opportunity, a young and adaptable species that could be guided, shaped, brought carefully into the fold the way dozens of species before us had been. Others argued we represented a risk precisely because we could not be easily shaped, because our decentralized nature meant no single treaty, no single agreement, no single leader could speak for all of us with total authority. Both sides were right, in their own way. Neither side understood what that actually meant for anyone who eventually decided to threaten us. My own involvement began 4 years after first contact, when I was a graduate student studying comparative diplomatic theory. Of all things, a field that had barely existed before the Verith broadcast, and suddenly could not train people fast enough. I was recruited not because I was exceptional, not in any way that would have stood out in a room, but because I had written a thesis paper, largely ignored at the time, arguing that humanity's greatest diplomatic advantage in any future first contact scenario would be our comfort with disagreement. Every alien species the Verath had briefed us about, once formal channels opened, operated on models of consensus, hierarchy, and unified voice. Speak with one mouth, present one position. Never let outsiders see internal disagreement, because disagreement was weakness, and weakness invited exploitation. Humanity had never operated that way, not once, not ever, and my paper argued that trying to force ourselves into that mold to appear more palatable to the Council would be the single greatest mistake we could make. Let them see the arguments. Let them see the messy, loud, contradictory process by which humans actually arrived at decisions. It would look undignified. It would also eventually become the thing they respected most, because it meant we could never be split apart by a single well-placed lie, the way so many other species could be, simply by convincing one leader to distrust another. I did not expect anyone to read that paper. 3 years later, I was standing in an actual council antechamber, wearing an actual diplomatic credential, watching alien delegates argue about whether my species deserved a seat at their table, and I understood, for the first time, that the argument I had written as an academic exercise was no longer theoretical. It was the entire strategy. The years between my recruitment and that first hearing in the Great Chamber were not quiet ones, though little of what happened during them ever made it into the official record the Council reviewed. There were incidents. Small ones at first. A trade dispute with a minor species near one of our earliest colonies, resolved not through council mediation but through direct negotiation, that left both sides satisfied enough to sign a lasting agreement without ever involving the wider galaxy. A survey mission from a species called the Dorith, testing the edges of our claimed territory the way the Verith once had, only to withdraw quietly after realizing that every human system, however small, however new, had already quietly established defensive coordination with its neighbors, without any central command ordering it to happen. The Council, watching from a comfortable distance, filed these incidents away as curiosities, isolated events, not yet a pattern worth real concern. They were wrong about that too, though it would take one more incident, larger than the others, before anyone with real power in that chamber started paying close attention. I remember the day the reports came in about what happened at the edge of the Kessa Belt, because I was the one who had to write the summary that eventually crossed Councillor Ordemos's desk, 3 years before I would ever sit across from that same jellyfish cathedral in person. I remember typing the words slowly, checking them twice, because even I, someone who had spent years arguing that humanity's decentralized strength was our greatest asset, had not fully understood what that strength looked like when it was actually tested. It looked, according to every account I later verified, like chaos. It performed like something else entirely. The next morning, the chamber doors opened for me without the pause they had given me the day before, and I understood immediately that something had changed overnight. The delegates were already seated when I arrived, which never happened, and their conversations, usually a low background hum of translated murmurs, stopped the moment I stepped through the doorway. I took my small chair at the end of the table without comment and set my folder down in front of me. Councillor Ordemos did not wait for the usual opening formalities. Attaché, before we begin, this council has received an updated sensor report from the Karsu Directorate Patrol stationed near the Outer Belt. I'd be glad to hear it, I said. The Karsu delegate from the day before rose slightly in her seat, and this time, there was something in her posture that had not been there before, a tightness that even someone unfamiliar with Karsu physiology could read as tension. Overnight, our sensors detected 2 additional signatures entering the outer edge of the system, consistent with the same vessel class as the Meridian's watch. The murmur that followed was louder this time, less controlled. 3 ships now, the Thren delegate said, his hum rising into something sharp. 3 armed human vessels positioned near this station during a membership vote. I ask again, and this time I expect a real answer. Is this an act of intimidation? I let the silence stretch for a moment, not out of theater this time, but because I wanted to be sure my next words landed exactly as intended. No, I said. It's a shift change. The chamber went quiet in a way I had come to recognize as genuine confusion rather than practiced diplomatic silence. Explain, Ordemos said. The Meridian's watch has been on station for 6 weeks, I said. Standard rotation for a vessel on long patrol duty is 6 to 8 weeks before relief arrives, depending on distance from resupply. The 2 additional ships your sensors detected are the relief vessels arriving to take over the patrol route, along with a support craft that will escort the Meridian's watch back toward friendly space for maintenance. You expect us to believe, the Karsu delegate said slowly, that 3 human warships happening to be present during this specific vote is simply routine scheduling. I don't expect you to believe anything, I said. I expect you to check. Your own patrol logs will show the pattern if you look for it. Human vessels have maintained this exact rotation near every system with an active human diplomatic presence for the past 6 years, long before this hearing was ever scheduled. If you compare the timing of this hearing against our patrol schedules, you'll find the hearing was fit around the rotation, not the other way around. Nobody moved a ship because of this vote. The vote happened to fall during an ordinary week. A pause. Then, quietly, from further down the table, a new voice entered the conversation. It belonged to a delegate I had not heard speak in either session so far, an elderly representative of the Ophiran systems, a species so old they had stopped counting their own years in anything but council cycles. If this is truly routine, the Ophiran delegate said, his voice slow and measured, carrying the particular weight of someone who had watched a great many species come and go, then I have a different question. Why does a species barely a decade into interstellar contact already maintain a rotating patrol presence around its diplomatic postings at all? Most young species we have encountered do not develop that habit until centuries after admission to this council, once they have learned, through unfortunate experience, that it is necessary. I looked at him, and for the first time since entering that chamber, I felt something shift in the room that was not suspicion or condescension, but genuine curiosity. Because we already learned that lesson, I said, before you ever found us. The Ophiran delegate tilted his head slightly. Explain. I opened my folder, not because I needed the papers inside it, but because the physical act of opening it seemed to settle the room, gave them something familiar to focus on while I spoke. Humanity's history, I said, is not a peaceful one. I won't pretend otherwise, because your own analysts have already read enough of our records to know that pretending would be pointless. We spent most of our history in conflict with each other, sometimes over resources, sometimes over ideas, sometimes over nothing more substantial than fear of the unfamiliar. We built weapons capable of ending our own civilization long before we ever left our own solar system. We came, more than once, closer to destroying ourselves than any species in this room has likely come to destroying itself, by any means other than natural catastrophe. The room was very still now. That history, I continued, is not something we are proud of, but it taught us something that, frankly, most of you have never had reason to learn. It taught us that safety is never permanent, that a peaceful decade does not guarantee a peaceful century, that the moment you stop preparing for the worst is very often the moment the worst arrives. We didn't develop the habit of maintaining defensive presence around our diplomatic postings because we expected trouble from you specifically. We developed it because, as a species, we have never once in our recorded history gone more than a generation without needing it. That sounds, the Karsu delegate said carefully, like a species that has never known peace. It sounds that way, I agreed, but I'd ask you to consider the alternative interpretation. We are a species that has never assumed peace was permanent, and because of that, we have never been caught unprepared when peace ended. Every species at this table has, at some point in its history, been surprised by conflict it did not see coming, because comfort made vigilance feel unnecessary. Humanity has that instinct baked in at a level most of you would call excessive. We call it Tuesday. A few translated words rippled through the chamber that I suspected were the closest thing to laughter several of these species were physically capable of producing. Quiet, startled, and immediately suppressed. "So you are telling us," Ordomos said, several eye stalks fixed on me now, "that the presence of these vessels is not a threat, but simply your species' default state. That humanity is, at all times, in every location, prepared for conflict it does not expect to happen." "Yes," I said. "That seems," the Thren delegate said, his hum edged with something that was no longer quite hostility, but had not yet become anything friendlier either, like a very exhausting way to exist. "It is," I said. "But it also means that in 11 years of contact with this galaxy, not one human diplomatic posting has ever been successfully threatened, ambushed, or coerced, despite 3 documented attempts by parties this council is aware of, and at least 2 more that never made it into any official report, because they were resolved before they became worth reporting." The room's stillness sharpened into something new. 2 more, the Ophiran delegate repeated. "Unreported incidents." "Yes," I said. "Why unreported?" "Because they didn't need to be," I said. "Nobody was harmed. Nothing was lost. The parties responsible were identified, warned, and in one case, quietly offered continued trade relations in exchange for future good behavior, which they accepted. We didn't report those incidents because reporting them would have served no purpose except to make the offending parties look bad in front of this council, and we had no interest in that. We got what we actually wanted, which was for the problem to stop happening, without needing to humiliate anyone to achieve it." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in that chamber. It was not confusion, and it was not hostility. It was the particular quiet of several very old, very powerful institutions, realizing, slowly and with visible discomfort, that they had spent 2 full sessions debating whether a species was ready to join their galaxy, when that species had, without any of them noticing, already been quietly managing its own small corner of that galaxy for years, competently, and largely without their help. Counselor Ordomos's eye stalks drifted toward the center of the table, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. "This council," Ordomos said finally, "will take a brief recess before continuing." I nodded and folded my hands again, and as the delegates began to rise and murmur among themselves, filing toward side chambers in small clusters of 2 and 3, I noticed the Karsu delegate had not moved. She remained seated, watching me across the length of the table, her expression as unreadable as ever. "You are enjoying this," she said, once the chamber had mostly emptied. "A little," I admitted. "Why?" I considered the question honestly before answering, because it deserved an honest answer. "Because for 11 years," I said, "the galaxy has looked at us and seen a problem to be solved, a species to be managed, contained, guided into acceptable behavior before we cause harm to ourselves or anyone else. I understand why. Our history gives you plenty of reason to be cautious. But nobody in this chamber has stopped, not once in 2 full sessions, to ask what it might mean that a species with our history has spent the last decade causing remarkably little harm to anyone, including ourselves, while quietly building the kind of stability most of your own histories took centuries longer to achieve. And you believe that is worth smiling about." "I believe," I said, standing and gathering my folder, "that being underestimated by people who should know better is one of the most useful advantages a person can have. I'd be foolish not to enjoy it a little." She studied me for a moment longer, and something in her stone-colored face shifted, not quite a smile, because I still was not certain her species had one, but something adjacent to respect. "You should know," she said, "that not everyone at this table shares my patience. The vote, when it comes, will not be simple." "I don't expect it to be," I said. "Nothing about this has been simple. I'd be suspicious if it suddenly became easy now." She left without responding to that, and I stood alone in the recessed chamber for a long moment, looking out through the tall viewport at the slow curve of the station, and somewhere beyond it, 3 human ships, doing exactly what they were built to do, quietly, without fanfare, without needing anyone's permission to keep doing it. Tomorrow, or perhaps later today, the vote would come, and whatever the council decided, I already knew one thing they did not yet understand. The vote had never really been about whether we were ready for them. It had been about whether they were ready for us. The Kessa Belt incident happened 3 years before I ever set foot in the council chamber, and I only knew the full details because I had spent months compiling the report that eventually reached Councillor Ordemas's desk, back when I still worked behind the scenes rather than in front of an audience of 9 ancient species. It began, as most difficult situations do, with something that seemed small at the time. A joint patrol had been organized along the edge of a mining territory shared by 3 species, the Dorith, the Verith, and, on a trial basis meant to test our reliability as a partner, humanity. The arrangement had been the Verith's idea, an attempt to give the young human fleet some supervised experience operating alongside established powers, a chance for the older species to observe us up close, under controlled conditions, rather than through second-hand reports. Nobody involved expected trouble. The Kessa Belt was a quiet region, valuable for its mineral deposits but far from any major population center, patrolled more as a formality than out of genuine concern. The trouble, when it arrived, came from a faction the Council would later classify as an unaffiliated raider group, a loose collection of ships crewed by beings who had abandoned their home civilizations generations earlier and now survived by preying on exactly the kind of vulnerable, lightly defended mining operations the Kessa Belt was full of. The raiders had done this before, many times, against many species, and they had a method that worked reliably because it exploited a weakness common to almost every organized fleet in the galaxy. They struck fast, overwhelmed local defenses before reinforcements could arrive, and retreated the moment resistance became costly, calculating with cold precision exactly how much damage they could inflict before the risk outweighed the reward. Against the Varath and Dorith patrol ships stationed nearby, this method worked exactly as it always had. Both fleets, following doctrine that had served them well for centuries, prioritized defensive formation and measured, coordinated response, waiting for confirmation from command before committing to any aggressive maneuver. It was sound doctrine. It had protected both species for a very long time. It was also, against a fast and unpredictable raider assault, exactly the kind of predictable behavior that let the raiders slip past the first wave of defense and reach the mining stations themselves within minutes. The human patrol vessel assigned to that sector, a mid-sized escort ship called the Amaranth, was under the command of a captain named Priya Deshmukh, a woman who, according to every account I later gathered, had exactly 11 minutes to make a decision that no doctrine manual had fully prepared her for. Standard protocol, the protocol every other fleet in that engagement was following, called for the Amaranth to hold position, request confirmation from the joint command structure, and wait for coordinated instructions before engaging. By the time that confirmation arrived, based on the timeline reconstructed afterward, the raiders would have already reached the mining stations and begun their assault. Captain Deshmukh did not wait for confirmation. What she did instead became, over the following months, one of the most studied and debated incidents in the short history of human military doctrine, not because it was reckless, but because it was not. Rather than engage the raiders head-on, which her ship was not equipped to survive against a force that size, she ordered the Amaranth to broadcast, on every open frequency the raiders were known to monitor, a message claiming that a much larger human reinforcement fleet was already inbound, timed to arrive within minutes. It was not true. No reinforcement fleet existed. The nearest human vessels capable of responding were hours away. But the raiders, who had learned through long experience that most fleets did not bluff during active combat, because the cost of a failed bluff was total loss, had no reliable way to know that. Their own doctrine, built around striking hard and retreating before serious resistance arrived, treated the possibility of a larger unseen force as a genuine threat worth avoiding, rather than a risk worth calling. While the raiders hesitated, reassessing the situation, Captain Deshmukh did something that no raider group operating in that region had ever seen a defending force do before. Instead of holding position defensively, waiting to be attacked, she moved the Amaranth directly into the raiders' most likely retreat path, cutting off their easiest route away from the system, and began broadcasting individual, specific threats against each of the raider vessels by name. Using intelligence data gathered from years of small trade disputes and cargo manifests, that human analysts, working quietly and largely unnoticed, had been compiling on independent raider groups throughout the region long before this incident ever happened. The raiders had not expected to be known. They had operated for years under the assumption that smaller, newer patrol forces like the human presence in this sector would be too unfamiliar with local threats to identify them individually. Discovering that a single human escort ship somehow already had detailed information on their vessels, their likely crew composition, and their typical operating patterns did more to unsettle them than the threat of direct combat ever could have. Two of the raider ships broke off the assault entirely and fled the system without engaging further. A third attempted to push through toward the mining stations regardless, and it was that ship, and that ship alone, that the Amaranth ultimately engaged directly, disabling it with a combination of precise, minimal force, and what the eventual raider survivors described, in an interrogation transcript I read many times afterward, as unnervingly calm communication throughout, like the ship's crew had already decided how this would end before it started. By the time the Verath and Doroth reinforcements finally arrived, following proper coordinated protocol exactly as their doctrine required, the engagement was already over. The mining stations were untouched. The raiders were scattered or disabled, and the human escort vessel responsible for all of it had sustained no casualties and only minor damage to its outer hull. The Verath commander who filed the official incident report struggled, according to colleagues who later spoke to me about it, to categorize what had happened. Captain Deshmukh's actions did not fit neatly into any existing doctrine the Verath recognized. She had not followed protocol. She had also not acted recklessly. She had, instead, done something the Verath's own centuries of military tradition had never fully prepared them to anticipate. She had assessed the situation in real time, discarded a plan that would have failed, improvised a new plan built on information gathered long before anyone knew it would be needed, and executed it with enough calm precision that an enemy force with decades of successful raids behind them chose to retreat rather than test whether the bluff was real. The initial Verath analysis, the same analysis that eventually made its way, heavily summarized, into the reports the Council reviewed, dismissed the incident as an isolated success, likely attributable to an unusually capable individual commander, rather than any broader pattern worth serious concern. A fluke, in other words, an outlier. I remember reading that conclusion for the first time and feeling something between frustration and quiet amusement, because by the time that report crossed my desk, I already had access to 4 other incidents, smaller, less dramatic, but strikingly similar in shape, where human commanders in isolated, under-supported positions had improvised solutions that violated established doctrine in ways that should not have worked and somehow did. It was not one exceptional captain, it was a pattern, repeated across different ships, different commanders, different situations, all sharing the same underlying trait, one that no alien analyst reviewing individual incidents in isolation had yet managed to name correctly. Every human officer, regardless of rank or posting, was trained from the earliest stages of their career to expect that the plan would fail. Not because human plans were poorly made, but because human military doctrine, shaped by a species with a long and uncomfortable relationship with uncertainty, assumed as a foundational principle that no plan survives first contact with an unpredictable enemy, and that the officers most likely to succeed were not the ones who followed procedure most rigidly, but the ones who could think clearly and improvise effectively the moment procedure stopped applying. It was, in its own way, the same lesson the Verath had learned about human diplomacy, playing out again on a different stage. We did not need a single rigid structure to succeed. We needed people trained to think for themselves, within a shared understanding of what mattered, and then trusted to act on that understanding, without waiting for permission that might not arrive in time. I finished compiling that report on a night I still remember clearly, sitting alone in a small office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the conclusion I had just written, and wondering whether anyone above me would actually read it carefully enough to understand what it meant. The Kessa Belt incident is not, I had written, an isolated event attributable to individual skill. It represents a consistent pattern in human command culture, one built on a foundational assumption that uncertainty, is the default condition of any engagement, not an exception to be managed. Analysts reviewing future incidents involving human forces should expect this pattern to repeat, and should not assume that the absence of centralized, rigid command structure indicates weakness. In our experience, it indicates the opposite. I submitted that report, knowing most of it would likely be trimmed down, softened, filtered through layers of diplomatic caution before it ever reached anyone with real authority to act on it. I was right. It was trimmed, softened, filtered. But somewhere, in some archive, in some analyst's private notes that I would not personally encounter again until years later, sitting across a council table from delegates who had clearly, finally, begun reading those old reports far more carefully than anyone had bothered to before, the full truth of what happened in the Kessa Belt had survived, waiting patiently for someone important enough to finally take it seriously. That day had apparently, at long last, arrived. The recess lasted longer than any pause in the 2 days I had spent in that chamber, and when the delegates finally filed back to their seats, something in the room had changed in a way I could not immediately name. The Thren delegate no longer looked at me with open disdain. He looked at me the way a person looks at a puzzle they have just realized they solved incorrectly, uncertain whether to feel curious or embarrassed. The Opheran delegate had brought with him, I noticed, a small data slate that had not been present in the earlier session, and he consulted it briefly before folding his hands and settling into a posture of careful attention. Counselor Ordemos did not waste time on formalities. "Attaché," Ordemos said, "before this council proceeds to a final vote, one delegate has requested to raise a specific concern. I will allow it, given the significance of what has already been discussed." The delegate who rose was not one who had spoken much before, a representative of a species called the Dorith, tall and angular, with a voice that carried an edge of genuine unease, rather than the practiced skepticism I had grown used to from the others. "During the recess," the Dorith delegate said, "this council reviewed the full, unredacted record of an incident that took place in the Kessa Belt 3 years ago. An incident that, until today, several of us understood only through a heavily summarized report." I said nothing, waiting. "I want to ask you directly," the Dorith delegate continued, "whether the actions taken by the human commander in that incident reflect an isolated judgment call, or whether they reflect something closer to standard expectation within your fleet." "Standard expectation," I said. "Meaning," the Dorith delegate said slowly, "that any human officer, placed in a similarly unsupported position, facing a similarly unexpected threat, would be trained and trusted to make a similarly independent decision, without waiting for higher authority to approve it first." "Yes," I said. A ripple passed through the chamber, quieter this time, more thoughtful than alarmed. "That is," the Dorith delegate said carefully, "a significant amount of authority to place in the hands of a single officer commanding a single ship." "It is," I agreed. "We've found the alternative costs more than it saves." "Explain." I considered how best to answer that, and settled, finally, on the truth as plainly as I could offer it. "Every other species at this table," I said, "has built its military and diplomatic structures around centralized authority, because centralized authority offers predictability, and predictability, for most of your histories, has been a reasonable trade for a small amount of flexibility lost. It works well when the threats you face are also predictable. It works less well when they are not." I let that sit for a moment before continuing. "Humanity has never had the luxury of predictable threats. Our history, both among ourselves and in our brief time interacting with your galaxy, has taught us that the moment you assume you understand exactly what danger looks like, danger changes shape specifically to exploit that assumption. So instead of building a structure that depends on every officer waiting for permission from someone farther away, who may not have accurate information in time, we built a structure that depends on training every officer to act correctly, without needing that permission at all." "And if an officer acts incorrectly," the Karsu delegate asked, from her seat further down the table, "what then?" "Then they answer for it," I said, "just as they would if they had waited too long and lost the mining stations anyway. We don't pretend independent judgment removes risk. It doesn't. It simply moves the risk to a place where the person best positioned to manage it is the one making the call. rather than someone hours away who might not fully understand the situation until it's already over. The Ophiran delegate spoke again, quietly, almost to himself. It is, in its own way, the same structure we observed in your diplomatic culture. Distributed judgment, trusted broadly, rather than concentrated narrowly. Yes, I said. It's not an accident that they look similar. They come from the same place. And where is that? Ordomos asked. I thought of the small kitchen where I had watched the first broadcast confirming we were not alone, of every argument I had ever had with people who disagreed with me, and somehow, eventually, found a way to work alongside me anyway, of Captain Deshmukh broadcasting a bluff into open space, because waiting for permission would have cost her the mining stations, of 3 ships quietly rotating through this very system, without needing anyone's authorization beyond a schedule set months in advance. From never being able to count on anyone else to save us in time, I said. So we learned, a very long time ago, to make sure every single one of us was capable of saving each other instead. The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Counselor Ordomos's central body shifted slightly within its containment field, a motion I had come to recognize, over 2 long sessions, as the closest thing this being had to a sigh. This council, Ordomos said, will now proceed to a vote. Before the vote began, Ordomos turned toward me one final time. Attaché, this council will allow you a closing statement, if you wish to make one. It is not required. I stood. I had not planned to stand. I had planned, if I am honest, to remain seated through the entire vote, to let the numbers speak for themselves, to let 2 days of careful, patient answers do whatever work they were going to do, without one final performance at the end. But something in that moment felt like it deserved more than sitting quietly, and so I stood, and I let myself say the thing I had been holding back since I first walked through those chamber doors. I want to tell you something, I said, that isn't in any report your analysts have read, because it isn't the kind of thing that shows up in sensor data or patrol logs. It's not a statistic, it's just true. The chamber, for once, gave me its full attention without needing to be asked. Every species at this table, I said, has, at some point in its history, faced a threat large enough to nearly end it. I've read enough of your own records, shared with us in good faith over the past 11 years, to know that much. The Varath nearly lost their homeworld to a plague, 4,000 years ago, before medicine advanced enough to stop it. The Ophiran fought a war among their own colonies that lasted 3 centuries and killed more of their people than any external threat ever has. The Karsu Directorate, less than 1,000 years ago, faced near total collapse when a resource crisis turned neighboring colonies against each other. Every one of you has your own version of this story. I paused, letting that sit. But here is the difference. For most of you, that story is ancient history. A single defining trauma, survived, and then, over the following centuries, slowly set aside as your civilizations grew comfortable, secure, confident that the worst had already happened and was unlikely to happen again in quite the same way. You built peaceful, stable societies, and you deserve credit for that. It's a genuine achievement. Humanity never got that luxury, I said. We didn't have one defining catastrophe safely locked away in ancient history. We had thousands of smaller ones, spread across our entire recorded existence, close enough together that we never had the chance to grow comfortable in between them. Wars, plagues, moments, more than once, where we came close enough to destroying ourselves entirely that historians still argue about how close it really was. We never got centuries of peace to soften us. What we got instead was a permanent, low-level awareness that safety is never something you're owed. It's something you build and rebuild, constantly, because the moment you stop, something eventually arrives to test whether you were paying attention. I looked around the table, at 9 ancient species who had spent 2 full days debating whether my people were civilized enough to sit among them. That's what the ships outside this station really are, I said. Not a threat, not a message, just habit. The same habit that made Captain Deshmukh broadcast a bluff into open space, rather than wait for permission that wouldn't have arrived in time. The same habit that made 400 separate governments coordinate a response to first contact within days, without anyone ordering them to. We plan for the worst by default, not because we expect the worst from you, specifically, but because we have never once in our history been wrong to plan for it eventually, from somewhere. I let my voice soften, just slightly. I understand why that makes some of you uneasy. A species that never fully relaxes is, by definition, a species that is always, in some small way, prepared for conflict. I won't pretend that isn't unsettling to hear, especially from people who have worked hard to build the kind of peace you now enjoy. But I'd ask you to consider what that preparation has actually produced. In the 11 years you've had a chance to watch us. Not aggression, not expansion at anyone else's expense. Just quiet, consistent stability, built by a species that refuses to assume it's guaranteed, and therefore never stops working to earn it. I closed my folder, the papers inside it still, in the end, completely unused. You've spent 2 days asking whether humanity is ready for the responsibilities that come with a seat at this table, I said. I think that's the wrong question. The real question is whether you're ready to have, sitting among you, a species that has never once assumed the galaxy owed its safety, and has therefore never stopped working to protect it. Because that species is not going anywhere. We were here before this vote. We'll be here after it, whichever way it goes. The only thing that actually changes today is whether we do that work as partners you've chosen to trust, or as neighbors you've decided to keep at arm's length, out of caution you haven't fully examined. I sat down. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, I finally understood the shape of the smile I had been carrying since the very first minute of this hearing, the one Counselor Ordomos had noticed, and no one else had thought to ask about. It was not confidence in a hidden weapon, or a fleet no one had counted, or some secret advantage waiting to be revealed at the perfect moment. There was no dramatic reveal coming, no final card left to play. It was simply the quiet, settled certainty of someone who had spent 2 days watching an ancient, powerful institution slowly work its way toward a conclusion my species had already reached on our own, years earlier, without needing anyone's permission to reach it. We had never been asking to be allowed into the galaxy as something small and fragile that needed protecting. We had already been protecting ourselves, and quietly helping to protect our neighbors, for over a decade. The vote happening in this chamber was not going to determine whether that was true. It was only going to determine whether the council was finally willing to admit it. That, I realized, sitting there in my small, deliberately uncomfortable chair, at the end of a very long table, was the entire reason I had been smiling from the very first moment I walked through those doors. Not because I knew we would win, but because, win or lose, nothing about who we actually were was going to change, based on what these 9 ancient species decided today. We would still be exactly what we had always been. Ready. The vote itself, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic compared to everything that had led up to it, which I suppose is how most important moments actually happen, quieter and less dramatic than the build-up suggests they will be. Counselor Ordomos called each delegation forward in turn, and each one gave a single-word response, translated a half-second later into the flat, careful tone the chamber's systems always used, stripping away whatever emotion the original word might have carried in its native language. The Thren delegate, who had opened the first session with open disdain, said, "Accept," and did not elaborate. The Dorith delegate, who had raised the sharpest concern about independent command authority, said, "Accept," and added quietly that his people would be requesting a formal exchange of military doctrine in the coming months, framed not as oversight, but as genuine interest. The Karsu delegate, when her turn came, held my gaze for a long moment before answering. "Accept," she said, and I would add, for the record, that this council owes the human attaché an apology for the tone of our first session, though I suspect she does not particularly need one. I did not respond to that, but I let myself smile again, openly this time, because there was no longer any reason to hide it. One by one, the delegations spoke, and one by one, the word "accept" moved around that long curved table until it reached the Ophiran delegate, the oldest voice in the room, who paused longer than any of the others before finally speaking. "Accept," he said, with genuine curiosity about what this council will look like in another century, once this table has had time to grow accustomed to a species that refuses to grow comfortable. Counselor Ordomos's central body drifted gently within its containment field as the final vote was recorded. and several of its many eyes turned toward me. One last time. Humanity's application for full membership in the Galactic Council, Ordemos said, is accepted, effective immediately. This council further recommends that the classification of human territory be updated from provisional threat monitoring to standard allied status, pending routine review. A quiet murmur passed through the chamber, not hostile this time, not even particularly formal. It sounded, more than anything, like a room full of very old, very careful beings, quietly adjusting to the fact that the world they had known for a very long time had just changed shape and would likely keep changing in ways they were only beginning to understand. I stood, gathered my folder of unused papers one final time, and inclined my head toward the table, a small gesture of respect that felt more honest than anything more elaborate would have. "Thank you," I said, and left it at that. Walking out of the chamber for what I hoped would be the last time as a probationary attaché rather than a full representative, I passed the Karsu delegate again, waiting near the doorway exactly as she had the day before. "You knew this would happen," she said. It was not quite a question, the same way it had not been a question the first time she said something similar. "I hoped it would," I said. "Hope and certainty aren't the same thing." "You didn't seem uncertain." "I wasn't uncertain about who we are," I said. "I was uncertain about whether this council would take the time to actually see it. You did. Some of you did, at least. That's more than I expected 2 days ago." She considered that for a moment, then said something I had not expected, quiet enough that I suspected it was not meant to be officially recorded. "The galaxy has spent a very long time believing that safety comes from certainty, from knowing exactly what to expect from your neighbors, and building comfortable, predictable relationships around that certainty. Your species does not offer that kind of comfort." "No," I agreed. "We don't." "And yet," she said, "I find myself, against every instinct my training gave me, more reassured by that than I expected to be." "Why?" "Because a species that has never assumed it was safe," she said, "is far less likely to grow careless about keeping others safe as well. I think, in time, this council will come to understand that as clearly as I am beginning to." I did not have a clever answer for that, so I simply nodded, and let the silence between us stand as its own kind of agreement. I walked the rest of the way back to the diplomatic quarters alone, past the long silver corridor where my reflection had slid beside me 2 days earlier, small and unremarkable in exactly the ways the council had once assumed mattered most. I reached my quarters, sat down at the small terminal, and sent a short message to the fleet liaison, the same one I had messaged after the very first session. "Vote passed. Full membership granted. Tell the Meridian's watch and the relief ships, thank you for keeping standard pattern." It mattered more than they probably realized. The reply came back within minutes, as it always did. "Good. Tell the council we said congratulations, and that the next rotation is already scheduled. Some things don't change just because the paperwork does." I read that twice, and smiled at it the same way I had smiled at nearly everything over the past 2 days. Quietly, privately, in a way that did not need an audience to feel complete. Outside my window, the stars turned slowly the way they always had, indifferent to treaties and votes, and the long, careful history that had brought one small, stubborn species from a single fragile world all the way to a seat at the galaxy's oldest table. Somewhere among those stars, 3 human ships continued their patrol, exactly as scheduled, exactly as they would keep doing, long after everyone in that chamber had stopped thinking about the vote that had just taken place. The galaxy, I understood now, was going to spend a long time adjusting to what humanity actually was, rather than what its oldest fears had assumed we might become. Some species would adjust quickly, the way the Karsu delegate already had. Others would take longer, hold on to their caution a while yet, watch us carefully before deciding we could finally be trusted the way old friends trust each other, without needing to check first. I did not mind the wait. We had never needed anyone's permission to become who we already were, and we were not going to need it now either. I turned away from the window, and for the first time since walking into that chamber 2 days earlier, I let the smile fade, not because there was nothing left to smile about, but because it had finally, quietly, done its job. The council still did not fully understand why I had been smiling from the very first moment I sat down in that small, uncomfortable chair at the end of their table. I suspected, in time, They would. And when that day finally came, I had a feeling the smile would not belong to me alone anymore. It would belong to every human who had ever refused to wait for permission to build something worth protecting, quietly, patiently, one small habit at a time, until the whole galaxy finally looked up and noticed what had been standing beside them all along,